Recluse is a glass cannon. She deals a lot of damage from a distance but doesn't have much health, so she isn't really geared towards melee, is what I would say if I had just picked her up. Like yes, the default playstyle is that you deal as much damage as you can from a safe distance, while your teammates take aggro for you. But in reality, there are a million ways to play this character. Anything and everything that you can think of that involves magic in some way is probably doable with her. That is when you use the right relics, equipment, and cocktails. Your default dodge is more focused around distancing yourself from enemies rather than being able to retaliate as fast as possible from a melee range, and that is because it has a lot of recovery frames, so using it to get away is how you use it in many situations. Still, that dodge gets the most iframes for a single dodge in the entire game, so it is very useful to dodge things like AoEs for example, which can be trickier to dodge with other characters. And for bigger enemies, their attacks are slower and more telegraphed, so this dodge is sometimes just perfect if you want to use melee on them. When you're safe from enemy attacks, your playstyle becomes more focused on a resource management game, and how you play that game can easily be the difference between being the most important member of your team or straight up just being a liability. Recluse's passive and skill go hand in hand, in that you absorb elemental residue from enemies or teammates that is based on the last instance of elemental damage dealt to them. And when you absorb 3 elements, you get to cast a magic cocktail spell based on the types of elements that you absorbed. Residues don't seem to have an expiration date, so I will be able to absorb residues off of my teammates long after the last fight that we've been through. Though having residues appear on your teammates is a bit buggy, so sometimes it takes a bit of trying to line up the camera with them a few times for it to actually show up. Absorbing residue from teammates is much easier when they're downed and you can actually lock onto them. And if you're using an elemental weapon or spell to revive them, then you can actually absorb that as well. Knowing that you can absorb residue from your teammates can be very useful though, because sometimes enemies will inflict the kind of element that you want to absorb when you or your teammates can't. Absorbing residue will give you back a flat 20 FP each time, and this doesn't scale when you level up, and so I think using Starlight Shards isn't really optional when you're playing Recluse. This of course becomes more apparent as the run goes on. When I first started playing Recluse, I had 2 massive issues with her. One was how spells would consume an obscene amount of stamina, leading me to having to wait for my stamina to regenerate before I could start casting spells again, which always felt like a waste of time. The other problem was how the whole cocktail system felt redundant. Cocktails were always outperformed by normal spells, and collecting residues felt very slow and clunky. But later I realized that these 2 problems actually cancel each other out, because when you absorb residue, you actually recover stamina instead of consuming it. And so there is a rhythm to Recluse's combat that I haven't really seen people talk about. You don't just cast spells and absorb residue whenever you feel like it. You cast spells until you nearly run out of stamina, and then you absorb residue or cast a cocktail spell to get that stamina back, so that you're able to go back to casting normal spells. I say nearly because you can't do these actions with a completely empty stamina bar, so you'd have to wait for it to regenerate a little bit, or ideally never completely run out of stamina, and instead do these actions when you're almost out. When comparing the difference between rhythm casting and casting whenever your stamina is available, we see that the DPS is basically the same, except that the person absorbing residue runs out of FP much later, so he can fight more. One more thing I don't see people talk about is the sheer difference in DPS between charging your spells and not charging them. When taking Night Comet as an example and comparing them side by side, we see that spamming the uncharged versions of your spells results in double the DPS. Of course, charging your spells conserves FP, because charged spells consume the same amount of FP per cast. But then again, there are so many ways to make this less of an issue. Like if you have a big FP bar, or if you're moving quickly between sites of grace, or if you're using your ultimate, or if you have the infinite FP cocktail. Of course, the dynamic between these 2 playstyles changes depending on what perks you get. But it's really hard to beat double DPS. Today's coffee break is sponsored by Awesome Hank. They were kind enough to send me these high-quality handkerchiefs. You might be asking, why should I use these over an old reliable tissue? Scratches, my fellow tarnished. Microfibers have this magical ability of cleaning surfaces without damaging them. As a modern individual, you carry around glasses, phones, laptops, and these get dirty over time. And what's better to clean them than a lens-grade microfiber-backed handkerchief? These are very durable because of their 3-layer design. They're even durable enough to clean a blade. That is, if you carry one around. Psycho. These handkerchiefs are easy to carry around, not just because of their compact size, but also because of the integrated lanyard. They have designs inspired by Dark Souls, among other pieces of media that you might like. This Elden Ring inspired one is my favorite, and I've been using it very extensively. But I've also been sent this more compact minimalistic one, which has been living in my pocket for a while now. And get this, no cheap labor here. They're all handmade in the old US of A. Now I can keep my phone in perfect condition to watch the latest Clanky Mocha video.
Welcome to the Battle Series.
When it comes to cocktails, you don't have to play around them much to be effective, but many of them are extremely good and are even worth building your entire character around, though there are a lot of combinations. One way I've seen people memorize the cocktails requiring 3 elements is to memorize the one element that they don't include. For example, Old Bat Magic gives you the lightning stake, and so on. Though if you main Recluse, you will probably memorize them all very quickly. Fact is, you probably have already. So instead of just going over them and telling you what they do, I might as well do that while ranking them from worst to best, to keep this interesting. But before we get to the rankings, I want to talk about one reason as to why many people don't care much for the cocktails. And that is how rare secret seals are. And my opinion is that while it is true that you need to go out of your way to get these seals, I think you need to be a bit more open-minded when it comes to applying elements. Not just in that you should coordinate with your teammates on what elements they're applying, but also that you should use melee weapons to apply them yourself when you can't find an incantation that gives you the element that you want. Melee weapons are usually better for revives than your spells, and so they are usually worth picking up. Not to mention that merchants are always guaranteed to have at least one melee weapon of each elemental type. One more thing I didn't know was how infused weapons weapon arts still have base game Elden Ring like scaling. And well, let me explain what I mean by that. There are purple and legendary weapons in this game, and these are all weapons that have a set weapon art that they always start with. And for those ones, unlike in base game Elden Ring, their weapon arts scale directly with how much damage you have with them. And the problem is, in this game they reduce the intelligence and faith scalings for all of these weapons. Meaning, for example, that a Halo Scythe will deal more damage with its weapon art on Wilder than Recluse, because they vastly reduce the faith scaling on this weapon. Blue and white weapons, however, are a completely different story. They come with any weapon art. They will be infused with the element of that weapon art and will have it scale with its corresponding elemental stat. For example, let's say that you find a scythe that has Sacred Ring of Light as its weapon art. This has the holy element, and so it scales with faith. And so the weapon art will deal more damage on Recluse than it does on Wilder, because she has an S scaling in faith. Despite this weapon art looking identical to the Halo Scythe weapon art, which is very funny. And so it makes sense to use weapons like this as Recluse for their weapon arts, because they will help you get the elements that you want and still deal optimal damage. This, by the way, only applies to holy and magic weapon arts, and also one fire weapon art. The rest of the fire weapon arts scale with strength, and the lightning weapon arts scale with dexterity. You shouldn't let that prevent you from using these weapons, but they will deal less damage. Another thing to note is that in general, it is just true that your spells will outpace most cocktails. This doesn't mean that they're bad, it just means that if you're going around doing nothing but collect cocktails and dealing low damage just to get the right cocktail, then you, more often than not, are just shooting yourself in the foot. And so the best way to use these is to coordinate with your teammates on which damage types they should be going for, so that collecting the right residues either becomes very easy or just happens seamlessly as part of your combat loop, so that you're always casting spells and not reducing your damage output. I know that this tangent has been going on for a while, but I still want to note something that is very strange about these cocktails. At first I expected them to count as character skills, because this is literally just what they are. But later I realized that they do work with the perk that increases damage negation when casting spells, meaning that they do in fact count as spells. This also means that they're affected by casting speed, and also the extended spell duration buff, which is very important considering that 4 of these cocktails are castable buffs that have a set duration. This made me ask the questions. Do they count as sorceries or incantations? Probably a mix of both, to be honest. And do they belong to different schools of magic? What do you think is the answer here, considering the huge amount of variety of cocktail spells that we have? Nope, you're wrong. They all count as sorceries and scale exclusively with intelligence. Way to go, FromSoft. And so even though many of these spells look like they could be incantations, they're all sorceries and are boosted by perks that increase sorcery damage. Also, none of them belong to any schools of magic. So you cannot boost them with magic school relics. So even what is very clearly a gravity spell doesn't belong to the gravity spell school, because fuck you, I guess. Also, none of these cocktails are chargeable, so charged sorcery perks don't work. Of course, spells, perks, or relics that boost damage types that correspond to any of these cocktails will boost these cocktails, so keep an eye out for those. There are 3 types of cocktails: 4 single spells, 8 double spells, and 4 mixed spells. Single spells require you to absorb 3 residues of the same element. Double spells require you to mix 2 elements, and mixed spells require you to mix 3 elements. The order of these elements does not matter, and for double spells, it doesn't matter which element that you have more of. People tend to say that more elements is straight up better, and this is somewhat true, but it is an oversimplification that doesn't really take everything into account. So, I'll be disregarding this idea in my ranking, and will just rank them based on how good these cocktails are to incorporate into your build or straight up build around. So without further ado, let's get to it. At number 14, we unsurprisingly have Pure Magic. This is obviously the easiest cocktail to get because you literally start with a way to get it. What it does is that it sends a small magic orb that follows the target and attacks them 4 times in short intervals. The damage is pathetic. The first instance of damage is like half of what you can do with a single glintstone pebble, and the ones after that deal even less damage. And so the main benefit of this is how it's guaranteed elemental damage that you can use to get your FP back, which can come in clutch in the early game where you can run out of FP and your teammates might not have elemental damage yet. One nice thing about this is that it staggers and overwhelms smaller enemies, so you could sometimes use this to kill them or keep them occupied, I guess. Overall, this is just fine. It does its job, but you'll never actively be trying to use it. At number 13, we have Pure Fire. This sends one fire projectile that explodes, leaving lingering fire damage on the ground. The damage here is again pathetic. It's less than what you can do with an Uncharged Flame Sling cast. But the main advantage of this is that it's constant fire damage that you can easily use to get your FP back. What makes this better than pure magic is that there are no intervals to wait for. You can just recover your FP 3 times in a row. You have to time this right though, because enemies can just move away from the lingering damage. At number 12, we have Pure Lightning. This changes your dodge to what is basically Bloodhound Step, making it much faster with less recovery frames. It also does a small lightning AoE that damages enemies that are very close to you, dealing decent enough damage. This has tons of versatility. You can cover much more distance much quicker, and you can use that to help with ranged combat or straight up go in with melee weapons and spells, knowing that you have a much better dodge now. Though the reason this finds itself this low on the list is its duration. At only 20 seconds, it doesn't feel nearly long enough to be anything other than a nice bonus sometimes. However, you can easily extend this to 40 seconds when you pick up the extended spell duration dormant power, in which case I would gladly center my build around this one, because 40 seconds is a much more reasonable time to actually make use of this, and most fights don't even last that long. So this one's really good, but it is dependent on you getting that power. One more thing about this spell is that every dodge counts as a spell cast, and will synergize with damage negation up while casting spells, meaning that if you have that and get roll caught, you might take less damage. At number 11, we have Mixed Fire Breath. You get this by combining fire, magic, and holy, all elements except lightning. You might be surprised to find a triple element spell this low in the list, but this is just a testament to how good other spells are, because although I don't like this one very much, it's not really that bad, but it does have a lot of problems. Like, the damage is undeniably high, it's around as much as a Wilder's ultimate if you land the entire attack, and it does heal your teammates and replenish their FP, which is pretty nice. You can even free aim this, which gives it a ton of versatility. But the problem with this is that it is basically a melee range spell, and it is one that locks you into a very long animation without increased defense or hyper armor. Recluse has one of the smallest health bars in the game, and so you can easily die or get interrupted while using this. The answer to that would be to use it at the right time, when you're sure that an enemy has their focus on someone else, or that they're staggered. And the other thing you could do with this is to use poise and negation buffs. And you can even boost the damage on this with a relic effect that boosts breath attacks. This relic effect boosts your damage by around 15%, and it can stack with itself up to 3 times, giving you a 52% damage buff. And yet, even with all of this, the damage is still somehow less than the Lightning Strike cocktail. And the problem is, this is an attack power buff, meaning that you can't have it show up with fire attack power. And you can't have it show up with the Evershare Relic either. And so, to be honest, this is just too much work to make this function. It's definitely possible, but I just wouldn't build around this one. At number 10, we have Lightning and Fire. It very quickly sends you towards your enemies, dealing high lightning AoE damage. Though for most Recluse builds, you don't really want to end up near your enemies, so I don't like this aspect too much. But still, the damage is undeniable, and if you're using melee spells, then this has great synergy with those. At number 9, we have Pure Holy. This one's amazing, to be honest. For 30 seconds, it not only increases your damage negation, it also increases your poise. And of course, you can extend this to 60 seconds with a dormant power. Now, many of your spells have really long animations, so adding poise to them can make sure that you actually land these spells instead of getting interrupted. And there are a lot of slow but powerful spells that you can pair with this, like Scarlet Ionia, Burn of Flame, and Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike. But you could also straight up play a tank-style Recluse with this, and use short-range spells like Carrion Slicer, Carrion Greatsword, or Shattering Crystal. I'd also recommend pairing this with things like the Malenia's Great Rune Relic, which does work with spells. I'd also pair this with any damage negation buffs and Recluse's ultimate for even more survivability. Overall, this one's just really good, and I'd gladly build around it. But it does have a couple of issues, like how it doesn't apply to your teammates even though its animation clearly implies that it should. And another problem is that it counts as an aura buff, meaning that you can't stack it with other aura buffs like Golden Vow. And like, why would FromSoft do this? All the other cocktails stack with each other and everything else. We were in the verge of greatness, we were this close! At number 8, we have Magic and Lightning. This summons a sword that you can use to send a magic wave dealing lightning damage to your enemies. The damage is high, the range is pretty good, and it doesn't even stop there because you can actually hold the sword to cancel or release the spell whenever you want, which is the only spell that lets you do this. It even deals more damage if you do it at a melee range. This spell is just perfect. I always love using it when I have lightning and I have zero complaints with it. At number 7, we have fire and magic. This is like a mix between pure magic and pure fire, except better in every way. It sends an orb of fire that lingers around an enemy, dealing constant fire damage, and letting you recover your FP before exploding, dealing extra damage. At first, I placed this much lower because I thought the damage was bad, but when testing it, I realized that if you're counting the damage over time plus the explosion, then you're actually dealing more damage overall than either magic lightning or lightning fire. This plus the fact that it is better at letting you recover your FP is why it finds itself above either of these two. Though I still prefer these two because they're just more fun to use. But hey, credit where credit is due. At number 6, we have magic and holy. This gives you infinite FP for 8 seconds or so, and can be extended with spell duration buffs. This is great because there are just so many good spells that consume tons of FP, like Comet Azure or the Dragon spells, and this gives you a head start when casting those spells. Another benefit to this is of course letting you use the uncharged versions of your spells, which will result in much more DPS. Another cool thing about this is that it doesn't care if you don't have enough FP to cast the spell in the first place. You can just cast it anyway, meaning that this can really come in clutch if you have an empty FP bar. This spell applies to your teammates, which if they're not playing Recluse, then they don't have a built-in way to recover FP. And many of the most powerful attacks in this game are either spells or weapon arts, so I don't really need to tell you how useful this is. You know, for the longest time, I thought that this spell improved your rune gain because of this icon. But no, it doesn't. This is just the icon for infinite FP when using consumables, which is like, wow. At number 5, we have Lightning and Holy, aka the auto parry. For the longest time, I thought this just wasn't very useful. Like, it only lasts 15 seconds. Even if you find an enemy that can be parried, they'll still have some attacks that cannot be parried. And so to me, this just seemed too situational. But then I realized that if an attack cannot be parried and it still lands on you, then the game would act as if this was a partial parry. Having this constantly on basically means that this spell is a shield that consumes a lot of stamina when you get hit, and yet you will not be staggered and will not be guard broken. Meaning that effectively you have infinite poise. And this essentially makes this the best poise casting tool in the entire game, because it will straight up block any attacks that come at you and you won't even flinch. You will get some chip damage though, which is why negation perks are amazing when using this, because they will reduce the chip damage. You could also use the Malenia's Great Rune Relic with this, which does work with spells, meaning that you can just recover that chip damage by attacking. And you could pair this with your ultimate for even better results. But why stop there? You can straight up just take a page from Raider's book and benefit from chip damage by stacking damage negation up when getting hit perks. And that way you'll get more damage negation without having to take a bigger hit. If you're feeling spicy, then you could even use the attack up when getting hit relic effect, making for a very different playstyle to what most people use with Recluse. All of this is for fighting non-parryable enemies. If the enemy is parryable, then you'll just destroy them, no questions asked. There are a lot of drawbacks to using this spell, however. First, if you do get hit before casting your spell, you won't be staggered of course, but it is likely that you'll lose your entire stamina bar, which will prevent you from doing any actions besides walking and healing. And the 15-second duration is still disgustingly low in my opinion. Overall, this spell is an abomination. I don't understand how this shit keeps happening. Did FromSoft intend for this to happen? Were they just okay with it working that way? Do they even know that this exists? I don't fucking know. But this has become my favorite spell to build around, and I will do it every single time that I find the spell duration buff. Like, I'll admit that this was number 1 on this list, before I realized just how bad the stamina thing was. At number 4, we have Ice Storm. You get this by combining Holy, Lightning, and Magic, all elements except for Fire, which does make sense. This summons a storm that deals magic damage over time and inflicts frostbite. And for the entire duration of this spell, you freeze yourself into an ice block, where you're completely invincible and can't even be grabbed. The fact that you're dealing so many ticks of damage over time to enemies is very likely to draw their attention to you, which is exactly what you want, because they can't do anything about it. And this gives your teammates room to breathe, which is very valuable. This spell will more often than not inflict the Frostbite status effect, which does deal good damage and makes enemies take 15% more damage from all damage sources. The reason that this is not higher is that Frostbite is the main source of damage for this, and status effect resistances increase each time that you inflict them, making this less valuable to use multiple times, not to mention that some enemies are just immune to it. At number 3 we have Fire Torch. This gives you and your teammates 30% more health for a full 75 seconds. This doesn't seem to be affected by extended spell duration buffs, and it's probably because it lasts so damn long already. The fact that flasks scale to your health in this game makes this a clean 30% increase to your effective health, making it one of the best buffs in the entire game. This spell also reduces the maximum HP of your enemies, which is only really useful if you use it at the beginning of a fight, when they still haven't taken any damage. Which is what you should do because you're not just making it more likely that your team survives the fight, you're also giving yourself a pretty good head start. At number 2 we have Lightning Strike. This instantly does an AoE attack that then sets up another AoE attack that comes out later. The damage of this is disgusting, especially if you hit both AoEs, because then you're dealing double the damage of Wilder's ultimate. This is sometimes hard to land, and to be honest, the damage isn't that much more than the Gravity Orb. In fact, you need to land both AoEs for it to be higher than that one at all. But the reason people like this so much is that it staggers bosses the way offensive ultimates do, which I do value a lot, because of the breathing room it gives me. To be honest, I could swap the placement of this at number 1 in any day of the week. They're very fun to use and nothing else in the game does this much damage. The damage is so high that these two are the main reason I'd win against Everdark Libra, because I just one-shot the NPCs, which always felt amazing. At number 1, we of course have Gravity Orb. You summon a Gravity Orb, it pulls enemies towards it, and it deals huge damage. The total damage is higher than the second part of the Lightning Strike. This one's easier to get because it has magic as one of its elements, and so this plus the fact that it has synergy with Terra Magica places this at number 1. Honestly, the whole cocktail system turned out to be much more fleshed out than I ever thought it would be. These are some of the most fun spells FromSoft has ever made, and if you're not making full use of them, you're really missing out. I want you to join my Discord server. You know, being a part of a community while it's still small is very fun in my opinion. And I want you to come ruin it by joining, so that you can enjoy it while making it worse for those who come after. Just like the boomers did in America, we have an LFG channel where you can play Nightreign with me and other members of this community. There's no reason for you not to join. Link in the description below. Next, let's talk about Recluse's ultimate. You deal a small amount of damage in an AoE, while placing a mark on enemies that you hit with it. And for 13 seconds, they take 15% extra damage from all damage sources. And any attacks that you do to them will recover you massive amounts of HP and FP. The range of this is huge. It's around this far, so you really don't need to get close to your enemies for it to work. I don't know why, but I keep making this mistake myself. This ultimate is just so flexible that it's never not useful, but it shines the most when you're using melee spells or spells that you can continually cast like Comet Azure, because then you just get infinite FP and HP. I mentioned Comet Azure multiple times now in favorable light, and some of you might have already written comments telling me that it is just trash. So let's talk about it and some of the more common spell options that we get, starting with sorceries. I think too many people criticize Comet Azure for not being FP efficient, saying that it's trash and whatnot. And while it may not be as good as it was in Elden Ring, this is still one of the spells that I use a lot as Recluse. Not just because it's very common to find, but because it's common to find on a purple staff, and these drop a lot from high tier bosses. And it really is one of the best ways to quickly melt bosses and enemies. And it really doesn't matter that it's not FP efficient. You have two built-in ways for Recluse to completely negate this issue. Crystal Torrent is a similar spell that has more DPS and consumes much less FP. And so while this may seem to be straight up better, Comet Azure still has its huge range going for it, which just lets you do stuff that you can't do otherwise. Also, it's not like Crystal Torrent is nearly as common as Comet Azure, though the best range spell to use with Recluse's ultimate or the infinite FP cocktail is probably Uncharged Comet, because it just has the highest DPS. Though overall, I do prefer Glintstone Comet Shard over this one, because it has similar DPS with less FP consumption. A more common option, however, is Night Comet, which slightly outdoes Comet Azure in terms of DPS, but is less than Comet and Comet Shard. But you're actually much more likely to find it because it comes by default on the Staff of Loss. Enemies cannot dodge this projectile either, so that's a great bonus and makes this my favorite magic projectile spell. Though, unless you randomly find it on a purple staff, you'll probably have to upgrade it with a stone shard, which is a bit of a hassle. The fact that Comet Azure is common on purple staves is what makes it situationally compete with otherwise much better options like this one. Another common option is Stars of Ruin. It really doesn't compete with any of these spells in terms of DPS, but it has amazing tracking and great synergy with the ultimate and the Malenia's Great Rune Relic. Shattering Crystal has even better synergy with these, but it is a very close range spell, so you need to be more careful with it. Though it is one of the most common spells that you can find because it shows up on two different blue staves that can drop. And of course, Carrion Slicer is just the best DPS spell that you can ever get. Fitting then that it is a melee spell, so it requires a bit of preparation. Other common spells include Renalla's Full Moon, which is amazing because it debuffs enemies against magic. And all of these are just trash. And that is because they're just too slow. These are better but are also way too slow. For incantations, it's less about the spells themselves and more about what you're fighting, in that different elements are stronger or weaker depending on what enemy you're fighting. Either way, when it comes to common spells, these ones are easily S tier, and these 4 not so much. Rejection is obviously trash because it does 0 damage. Flame Sling is not really that bad. It is pretty good if you have nothing else. But otherwise, it's completely outdone by other common incantations and especially Black Flame, which is better in every conceivable way. Bestial Sling doesn't even have an element, or nearly enough damage, and it doesn't justify that by having good poise damage. And Wrath of Gold is just way too slow. Now, let's talk about perks to use. When it comes to FP, reduced FP cost is better than a bigger FP bar, because of multiplicative inverse scaling. You don't need to know the math, just trust me. It works exactly like how negation works with relation to HP. The difference is there and it gets bigger the more of these you stack. Another benefit to having reduced FP consumption is that it makes the FP you get by absorbing residue matter much more, because then it represents a bigger percentage of your total max FP. For other perks, of course you want perks that boost sorceries, incantations, and elemental damage based on what you're currently using. But improved sorceries is probably the best one for most setups, because again, it doesn't just boost sorceries that you cast with your staff, but also your cocktail damage. The Scorpion Charms don't have as much of a negation nerf as they did in base Elden Ring, so they're always worth picking up if they correspond to the element that you're using. Primal Glintstone Blade looks very scary, but I think it can be worth using if you're playing a ranged Recluse and know what you're doing in terms of dodging and such. But you really need to take it off before fighting the Night Lord, otherwise you're just shooting yourself in the foot. This talisman, by the way, decreases your spell FP consumption by 25%, but because of the inverse relation, this ends up making your effective FP bar 33% bigger, while also making the FP you recover by collecting residues more valuable. Improved skill cooldown does exactly nothing to Recluse, because her skill has no cooldown, so this is less than useless. Improved Flask HP restoration is a must for Recluse, because she's very squishy, and so healing once when you are at low health usually doesn't put you out of the one-shot range, and healing twice wastes a lot of flasks. So having 1 or 2 of these kinda negates this issue. Improved damage negation while casting spells works with your normal spells, and also your cocktails. And if you're playing Recluse, you always want to be casting spells, and so this effect is just amazing. But beware, because the game seems to be bugged, and you can't stack 2 of these unless they have 2 different values. Extended spell duration has quickly become one of my favorite perks, and it's easy to see why, because it works with some of the best buffs in the game, like Golden Vow or Flame Grant Me Strength, and it also works with 3 of your cocktails, so this is usually a no-brainer for me. And finally, all the walking perks are a great bonus to your damage output if you're using sorceries that have you walk while casting them, which is a lot of them. Next, let's talk relics. Overall, I don't think there is a single true must-have relic on Recluse, besides the Evershare relic of course, which you already know is the best one, so we will conveniently ignore it because I think it's boring and I don't like it. When it comes to Recluse's character-specific relics, there are 3 of them. One gives you Terra Magica when you collect a residue, giving you a 15% damage buff to all magic damage as long as you're standing on the sigil it creates. The problem with this is that you need the effect to end before you can activate it again by absorbing residue. Overall, if you're building around sorceries, this is very valuable to you. Next, we have an effect that makes you bleed when you activate your ultimate, giving you a 15% damage buff for 30 seconds. And 30 seconds is usually all that you need, because this is amazing for melting bosses very quickly, which is one of the things that your ultimate is already very good at. The bleed really doesn't matter that much, because just hitting anything with your spells will give you that health back. The best thing about this is how it synergizes with perks that give you more damage when something bleeds near you. And if you have one of these, then your ultimate is giving you a 58% damage boost instead of just 15. And so this effect is pretty damn good. I'd recommend pairing it with the effect that gives you more ultimate charge when you kill enemies, because that's just the best relic effect for having your ultimate as often as possible throughout your entire run, and so you can just use it to melt more bosses faster. This relic is the closest thing that Recluse has to a must-have. It's good regardless of your playstyle, and so generally I try to have this on every single build that I make. The final Recluse specific relic gives you 30% more HP for 40 seconds when you activate your ultimate. This probably isn't the most valuable thing in most builds, but still, more health is nice, especially for a squishy character like Recluse. Though if you're not specifically building your character to use your ultimate as often as possible, or stacking this with a torch cocktail, then I probably wouldn't bother. Next, let's compare the FP relic effects. Too many people overlook these in favor of damage, but as we discussed, more FP means that you can spam uncharged versions of your spells, and spend less time regaining FP on average, which will increase your DPS by a lot. There are 2 relic effects that increase your FP when you have 3 staves or seals in your inventory. These increase your FP by a flat 50 points. Now, you do start the game with 80 FP, meaning that at level 1, this is more than a 60% increase to your FP, which is absurdly high. And at level 15, it's a 25% increase, which is still very high. The downside to this is that you have to carry around 3 catalysts of the same type to benefit, and you might not always have the best passives on those. But honestly, I really found this to be a problem, especially with staves, because you find so many of them already. The other relic effect that increases your FP does so when you visit a Sorcerer Rise. It increases your FP by 18%, meaning that you need to visit 2 rises to outdo the first effect. So the other one gives you more, but this one's for you if you don't want to carry 3 catalysts at all times, because you just get the buff and you don't have to think about it anymore. And you do want to visit Sorcerer Rises anyway, because you're guaranteed to find Starlight Shards and the staff there. Next, let's talk about specialization, and whether you should build around sorceries or incantations. If you don't know, there are various relic effects that improve your damage with certain magic schools by 12%, and you can stack these for up to a 40% increase in damage. One problem with this is that many of the best spells don't belong to a magic school that you can boost with relics. Some people say that your build should depend on the boss that you're facing. The idea is that bosses have different resistances and weaknesses to different damage types. For sorcery, half of the Night Lords resist magic, while the other half is neutral to it. However, 7 out of the 8 Night Lords have elemental resistances and weaknesses that are much more pronounced. So the argument is to build around the incantation type that these bosses are weaker to. One problem with this is that unlike staves, seals don't really drop often for Recluse. They're not part of her class-specific loot pool, and so you absolutely need to go out of your way to find seals by visiting shops and cathedrals. And one problem with that is that most cathedral drops will be White Finger seals, and these have a useless first spell. And because incantations have so many non-offensive spells, you might get a useless secondary spell as well. Another thing to consider is that the Deep of Night mode is coming out less than 2 weeks after this video. This is a harder difficulty mode, where you will not be able to choose which boss to go after. And so building around sorceries will be much better in that mode. Another thing to mention is that by using only pre-made relics, you're getting a 28% damage buff to all sorceries that deal magic damage, and you also get a lot of other nice bonuses that make life much easier. And so for consistency, it makes much more sense to use this or build around sorceries for the 4 Night Lords that are neutral to magic damage. For bosses that resist sorcery, it just depends on what you want. Sorceries will give you more consistency, while incantations will give you higher highs. One thing to note is that sorceries deal more damage on average than incantations, and so the difference between them on these bosses is not nearly as big as the resistance numbers would suggest. For me, I would only specialize if I'm not doing it at the expense of better relics. Like, I think you should have good relics with these to justify having them on. So for example, while it might look like just having one of these school specific effects is probably better than the Bleed Ultimate effect, because one applies at all times and the other only applies in your ultimate, the reality is that you'll not always find the school that you want, but you'll always have your ultimate. Not to mention that this effect is not really competing with just that effect, it's competing with this entire relic. And so in my opinion, you should only specialize if you're beating out these default relics. So you should have at least Bleed Ultimate in your build and ideally Terra Magica. With all that considered, let's talk about actual specialization relics. For sorceries, there are 7 schools that you can specialize in, but only 3 are worth going for, simply because the spells associated with the other ones are just bad. Those are the Kyrian Sword sorceries, the Invisibility sorceries, and the Crystallian sorceries. And all of these are amazing spells for reasons I already mentioned, with the Crystallian sorceries being especially consistent because they show up by default on 2 different staves, and so you're more likely to find them. For incantations, I'd only specialize in Godslayer or Dragon Cult incantations, and these are the only ones that are good and common enough to find, because they have associated blue seals. Unfortunately, Flame Sling doesn't count as a Giant's Flame incantation, so there is no reason to choose that one. The cool thing is that Fire and Lightning are the 2 elements that you need against bosses that are resistant to magic damage, so it all works out in the end. For other effects, the Bleed Ultimate Relic is just as good here as it is with sorceries, and Terra Magica keeps you flexible enough to use magic effectively if you don't get the spells that you want. Finally, let's talk about my relic setups. Again, I don't use Evergel because I don't like it, but nothing here is truly better than Evergel, so feel free to replace what you like the least with it. First, I have this relic setup that I've mentioned multiple times in the video. It's only using relics that you get from Recluse's Remembrance quest and from the Everdark shop. And this is just very solid. You get all the good stuff here. You get the damage boosts and a huge FP bar. You need some seriously good RNG to beat this, to be honest. Next, I have my specialized melee focused Recluse. This is focused around poise casting, specifically with Kyrian Slicer or other sword sorceries. And of course, the Pure Holy or the Lightning Holy cocktails. I got a couple of god rolls with all the bonuses that I want. Though, to be honest, I wish I had the Crystallian sorceries instead. that, especially with how these have better synergy with the Millennia's Great Rune Relic. I'm pairing these two relics with the Everdark Ogre Relic, which is one of the best relics for general survivability. The maximum HP effect gives you 100 extra HP, which at level 1, this is a 33% boost for Recluse, and at level 15, it's more like 13%, so it's never really a small buff. Healing over time doesn't come in play too often, but it's just nice to have, and the healing at low HP relic doesn't work at all like how you expect it to work, in that it doesn't heal you up to a certain threshold when you're at low health. Instead, it's a passive healing buff that activates when you reach low health, and that means that it keeps working even if you heal past that threshold. And so it's a much better effect than you might expect. I think this is it for today. This was my Recluse guide. We're done with all the characters now, except Wilder, and I have no idea what there is to say about him, but that's for future me to worry about. If you like this video, please leave a like, a comment, and consider joining my Discord server. That's all I had to say. Bye-bye!